All right, next up. Our next speaker is a longtime listener, first-time caller. She's come to many, many of these conferences. I think this one and the one in New York is their first time giving a talk. That does happen. If you attend often enough, you will give a talk. She ran her first marathon Sunday. Remember all that traffic in DC? That was her. All right. Everyone, please welcome Laura.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Gast, and I'm bringing us home today, I guess. So some of you may know me, some of you may not, but usually I'm the person standing up here taking a lot of time to talk about why design is absolutely critical for effective communication. I've given several talks, posit now 2 years running, I go in and I talk about why even the smallest details are really important when you're designing something. I am this person when it comes to the fine tuning of design for communication, to get your message as quickly as you can to the people that need to hear it. No wasted time, let's get to the point. So it may be weird today that I'm actually going to talk about why Comic Sans is not as bad as you think it is. By the end of this talk, I hope you're gonna go like, all right, Comic Sans, that's fine. But I'll get to that. So my actual talk today is on the concept of disfluency. But to get to that, we need to talk about fluency first. So what do I mean about fluency? We usually think about maybe our second language. We're fluent in Spanish as well as English. Or we might think about the fluency of water. So things that move cleanly. We think we want a fluent message at all times. So when is fluency extremely useful? So let's talk about a study that has the groundbreaking title, "If it's hard to read, it's hard to do." Seems obvious. They went and studied it. So this is a 2008 study that said people are more likely to engage in a given behavior the less effort it requires. Doesn't sound groundbreaking, but it was important we confirmed this. So 2 groups of people were given an exercise regimen, exactly the same in 2 fonts, one in an easy to read Arial font and the other in a slightly harder to read brush font, right? These groups were asked to estimate how long they thought it would take them to do the exercise, how hard they thought the exercise was, the exercise regimen. Then they were asked to do the exercise regimen and report back how long it took them to do it. With just the change of font, the people that read the brush font estimated it would take them longer, it would be harder, and it actually ended up taking them significantly longer to complete the task. They were also less likely to fully complete the task. Again, not groundbreaking, but this slight increase in the mental effort, the cognitive load it takes just to read that slightly harder to read font made people think this task was harder, right? So, the result of this is that people are more likely to do something if they think it's easy, and people are more likely to think things are easier if you make it easier to read. A equals B, B equals C, therefore A equals C. People are more likely to do something if you put it in an easier to read font. Cool, great, not groundbreaking, but important we confirm that fact. The problem is when things seem too easy, right? So now let's get into the other side of this, the concept of disfluency. This disfluent message actually might be preferable to a fluent message in certain situations. We're going to talk about that. So what do I mean by disfluency? I mean the metacognitive experience of difficulty associated with a cognitive task. That is to say, interruptions or irregularities that disrupt the flow of a communicated message, making it more challenging for the reader or listener to process and understand. So, how does this affect us? Oops, sorry. Things that you think are too easy, you might think are less important. So you won't think about it as much, you won't weight it as heavily, you're not going to spend any effort in it, right? The first time you learned to tie your shoes, it was hard and you got that great dopamine hit and you're like, I can tie my shoes. Now I'm going to guess nobody in this room is going to get a dopamine hit from tying their shoes in the morning, right? So it became so easy that you're just like, whatever, it's not good. That's why it's also really, really rewarding when you squash that really complicated, crappy bug and you get really annoyed at yourself when the whole bug was just you missed a semicolon, right? It's that same reward pathway. So the disfluency effect posits that when something requires a little bit more effort, it leads to better memory and recall because you're using that effort, you're getting that mental hit, right? That dopamine hit. So if you're already bought into something, if you're already excited to do something, that's going to drive you over the edge. Benji mentioned yesterday thinking fast and slow. Jen Kahneman talks about system 1 and system 2. System 1 is his quick and intuitive. It's that too easy, let's get it done. System 2 is the deliberate and analytical. A disfluent signal, we'll talk about that in a second, signals your brain to go to that second system. Signals your brain to say, hey, we're gonna dig down a little bit in here. We're gonna challenge some assumptions. We're gonna get better problem solving. We're gonna bring our brain in a little more. So what do I mean by disfluent signals? So in written language, that might be complex or overly technical jargon. You're gonna stumble on this a little bit. It's gonna take you a little longer to read. But also font changes, simply putting a word in bold. There's actually a small task switch that goes on in your brain when you read regular text to a bold word to back to regular text. Could also be decorative fonts, or it could be awkward or complex syntax. That also works for spoken language, and we usually think about these as pauses or filler words like and like, repetitions and hesitations, kind of when you go and repetitions and hesitations, or mispronunciations. So how does that work? This is not a cognitive neuroscience lecture, so I'm not going to get too deep into it, but the difference is attention capture versus attention orienting. Attention capture, yeah, thank you. Usually I have a friend will do something like that. As soon as I say it, they'll throw a book down, and that's attention capture. It's this immediate, quick, you're drawing attention. It's that unthinking, it's just a reaction to a stimulus, right? You don't really have control over it. There's no intention behind it when you focus on that thing. Attention orienting, we had a talk today, I think it was Alex, who was talking about those pre-attentive attributes. That's orienting. It's giving you signposts. You're in control. You're looking. There's an intention to it. So attention is a directive to a focus, and then the orienting is the choice to engage. Both are absolutely critical for effective information communication, information processing, memory, and recall. And both of these are involved in disfluency. So let's talk about disfluency in writing. So, of course, we are going to have an example study, and we're going to start with Princeton. And when everybody hears Princeton University, obviously they think aliens. So this is a study done, with the best study groups you can ever get, college freshmen and psychology courses. And they were brought into a room and paid a couple bucks and were given some sheets about some alien species that were meant to approximate like taxonomy in a biology class, right? So they were given these info sheets about 2 hypothetical alien species and were asked to memorize them, right? So some got them in a disfluent font, this Comic Sans or Bodoni NT, I've never used that one. And then the rest of them were given it in this easier, more fluent font area. They had 90 seconds to study their info sheets. Then they were distracted for 15 minutes. And then they had a 7-question test. And this isn't a scientific review or methods class. We'll get to the end of it. Participants were called 15% more information when the material was presented disfluently than fluently. That is to say, all we did was change it to Comic Sans, and people remembered information a little bit better. It stuck in there a little bit better 15 minutes later. So, that's just recall, right? Just remembering facts. We've all had those history classes where you just have to remember all the dates. That could help in those situations. But really what we want to do is deeply encode and understand information better. And so I'm surprised that this study actually exists, because taking high school students in the mid-2000s in a small town in Ohio is an interesting study population. They did this in this study for a whole semester. They took 2 groups of students in AP classes, AP and advanced classes, and they translated all of the course documentation into Comic Sans. And they took these classes, AP Physics, Honors Physics, Chemistry, English. Can you imagine doing all of your AP Physics class in Comic Sans? I cannot believe that they got this study through, and more power to those teachers for getting it done. This is not a methodologies class. This is a really cool study to go read. It's cited down there at the bottom. But the long and the short of it is that test scores actually improved. Not in a big way, but in a statistically meaningful way against the paired classes. All that changed was the PowerPoints and the handouts were now in Comic Sans rather than whatever the teacher was using before. Maybe. people have tried to repeat this study. And again, it's really hard to get a whole semester in a public high school in America and say, we're going to take your work teacher and put it in Comic Sans and see what happens. So they've done controlled experiments and they've tried to figure this out. And as anybody who knows anybody in education or has a student, it's really hard to measure what things are changing in a classroom, right? So it's a difficult study to echo, but there's some underlying some things there, and they're continuing to study this. So, maybe we shouldn't be too hard on people who use Comic Sans when they need somebody to remember something. Not only it got them to recall that information, we were able, just through the use of Comic Sans, to get them to understand and engage a little bit more with that information. So like I said, this is a concept that gets studied a lot because it's quite easy. And there's a lot of good, not major lifts, but small lifts across the literature that you can see using these kinds of fonts. A lot of the times they use Comic Sans, but a handful of years ago, a group in Australia decided, let's study all these Disfluent fonts in detail and come up with a whole new font set that we can design that will be a Disfluency related font, and let's put all of our education materials in that. So that exists. This is open source. You can go download this font and go play with it yourself if you'd like. So I'm going to move on really quickly. We're going to talk about Disfluency in speech. How many people have taken a public speaking class where you were told no ums, no likes, read exactly perfectly? Who's had those classes, been told by someone you care about or trust that you've said too many times? I'm here to give you a little ammo to fight back. So in these types of studies, they usually take some sort of story. In this study that I'm citing here, they used Alice in Wonderland. And so they would have people listen to someone telling them this story. And there were two types of situations. One big set, they would read exactly as Alice in Wonderland, we all know and understand. Another set, they would actually change some of the facts. So you didn't have a preconceived notion. We kind of all know sort of what's going on in Alice in Wonderland. So what they would do is they would take the story or the altered story. Some would get it in the fluent state, so just cleanly, no filler words. Some would get it with an or an placed in certain specific locations, and some would get a cough, right? So this is adding the test of what's called a linguistic filler or a non-linguistic filler, right? So these are big two groups. So what ended up happening in this study, and again, it's like two parts of a study. There's the manipulated and the non-manipulated story. It turns out that with the people recalled more facts, right? And so you look at that manipulated, right? This is like we gotcha, it wasn't Alice, her name was Andy or whatever. In the manipulated story, you can see that both of the linguistic interruptions were about the same height, but people kind of had some pre-knowledge in the non-manipulated story, right? So this is showing that is actually having some effect to direct your attention, to orient you, to remember that something's coming, to pay attention to that item. The really interesting thing is that the coughs, the non-linguistic interruptions, actually decreased recall of the story. And so this is, providing some evidence that these fillers can be attributed not just to processing time, because these were matched. The ums and the coughs were matched for time. So it's not just that your brain is having more time to process information. There's something to the natural language process of saying in the middle of a sentence before usually a shift in story or an important noun or important point. So these types of interruptions were perfectly matched, but they showed very divergent outcomes, which I think is really cool. So they've also done what are called predictive filler and non-predictive. Again, I'm very lightly touching on this. We're not going to get too in depth on this. But predictive filler means it's right before I say something important, or it's right before I said, and there was the thing, important information, right? So it's where is that spacing? And so they'll take a long list. This is only part of one of these studies where there was the fluent situation. Then they also had filler in the early position. They'd have pauses. They'd put these in different positions. And they would test this on large groups of people and see where they remembered, in this case, a story about a skiing accident, right? The results are a whole bunch of tables because there were so many versions on this. It's very interesting. I recommend going to check out the study, but the too long didn't read is that these the linguistic portions, the ums, not the coughs, but the ums actually directed attention of the audience. And there was a short-lived memory boost. So people were calling that information a little better. If you put the before leg, people remembered, oh, the sister broke the leg, right? It's short-lived as in it comes for the word next. You're not going to get it for words farther away. Anybody who does LLM tokenization and all these language models understands the nearness of the word is important. So, this is just evidence to show there are a lot of these studies that are showing that type of idea, the next to an important word does increase the recall, does increase understanding of a story. However, remember this font that was very carefully designed over years and years and had a professional font designer come in and make sure that all of these exactly pieces of Disfluency were exactly where they were, had the most science behind them. Comic Sans works better. They're failing to find the effects that Comic Sans has using this perfectly designed or theoretically perfectly designed font. So like anything, there's a boundary, right? There's a boundary limitation between where this should be. Obviously, we're not going to put things in Windigs and expect people to understand them. That's an extremely disfluent font. But somewhere in there is the truth. We can't just keep extrapolating Disfluency out. So somewhere, somehow, Disfluency is helpful. But there's a difference between what is the best level, what is the best for this task, and what is the best for me. Adobe had a really interesting study, and they invested in a lot of this research. It's very interesting to go rabbit hole down one day if you get bored. But here's one of their blog posts from a couple of years ago talking about the need to personalize fonts for individual readers. And to summarize this big long post and all the research behind it, different readers read fastest in different fonts without losing comprehension. Not exactly groundbreaking, but interesting that you can read faster or slower and get the same comprehension. People read their fastest font. They were only studying fluent fonts here. You're reading your fastest font 35% faster than your slowest fluent font. And also your fastest font isn't always your favorite, right? So these are the things that can underlie why Comic Sans work better in AP Physics than it did AP History, right? These same human things, maybe that particular class of 30 students likes a different font than other people, right? And so if you want to get more into this and think more in depth about what is readability and understanding and where is that perfect boundary limitation, this is the Readability Consortium. They're a great group. They have a lot of great backers, Google, Adobe, etc. It's the Readability Consortium, and they're working on big research behind what is the best format to deliver to people. Should we make web pages where you can pick your own font? How would that impact a lot of things, and not just education, but also marketing? There's a lot of research into what font you pick for your logo for your business will increase or decrease memorability of that. So anyway, so I gave you a lot of stuff, and hopefully you hate Comic Sans a little bit less today. And I kind of threw a lot of my evidence under the table, but you're allowed to say and you're allowed to use Comic Sans, and you don't need to make things perfectly easy all the time, because you want your audience to have a little bit of a dopamine hit when they solve something. Thank you.